Hello, and welcome to Controversies in Church History, the podcast that takes you through the most controversial and important events, ideas, people in the history of the Catholic Church, centered on Rome. Welcome, my name is Derek Taylor. I'm your host for this podcast. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. You can find us on the web at churchcontroversies.com, on Facebook, YouTube channel with a podcast posted there. And so please visit. We have some other content on the website. And you can find the podcast on pretty much any of your major podcast platforms. This episode is the third in the ongoing series on Catholic Liberalism. And its title is Lamennais and the Origins of Liberalism, 1817 to 1834. Just to recap, we did in the first two episodes, I talked about in the first episode what Catholic liberalism is as a 19th century phenomenon, a movement within the Catholic Church to get the Church to adapt modern ideas of liberty, separation of church and state, stuff like that, to give up its privileges, legally speaking, and to adapt to modern society. In the second episode, I went through the church history of the church after 1789, particularly in France, because that's really one of the centers of Catholic liberalism is in the 19th century, emerges there, and in other places as well. We'll get to those. But if there's one major figure who he doesn't invent it necessarily, but he's basically the spiritual godfather of Catholic liberalism, and that is Felicite Robert de Lamennais. And so this episode is going to focus a lot on him. And who was Lamennais? Lamennais was born in 1782 in Brittany at Saint-Malo. So he's a Breton from that area of France. And the son of a noble merchant. When he was young, he was sent to live with his uncle. His uncle had a really extensive library, and he read widely in it. But he read Enlightenment philosophy, Voltaire, Rousseau in particular, and as a teenager became estranged from the faith until his brother, Jean, who was had been recently ordained a priest, brought him back to the faith through study, went to go through the Bible and things like that. And with his brother, they both decided to serve the church through study. And so he began to collaborate with his brother Jean. He read all the sort of great reactionary thinkers of that era, people I mentioned on the last podcast, de Bonald, de Maistre, but also Bossuet was a 17th century French writer about the Bible. And they wrote apologetic works, did the two brothers. And one thing about Lamennais I'll mention is he was kind of a sickly guy, had bouts of depression. He was a very sensitive person. This will be, I think, important later on to know. But in between bouts of depression, they wrote two apologetic works in 1809 and 1814, both aimed at the religious policy of Napoleon. And in these, the brothers argued for the freedom of the church from state interference. And I'm going to explain this. What they're referring to is sometimes called Gallicanism in French history. And Gallicanism just refers to, and this goes back to the late Middle Ages, the assertion of royal control over the church prior to the Revolution. The things like, the King of France claiming the right to appoint bishops, controlling church property, stuff like this. That was something that was fairly commonplace. The French monarchy had a lot more control over the church in its country than the other monarchies across Europe. And so they're beginning to reject this already in the age of Napoleon, because Napoleon basically is a military dictator. He basically continues this. But, and this is where he becomes really important, is that Lamennais strikes out on his own as an apologist. And in 1817, he publishes the first volume of a work called An Essay on Indifference in the Matter of Religion, which became I want to say it was the best-selling book in the entirety of the Restoration period in France. It was a sensation. And what he basically says in this is that individual reason, and one of the things he's trying to overcome the tendency towards skepticism and rationalism in French life, which is very rife among the middle classes, professional classes in France. And one of the things he insisted upon in this work is that individual reason can't attain certainty of knowledge or truth by itself, and therefore it must be found in society and guided by an infallible authority, i.e. the Pope. In other words, to have certainty, you need authority, an infallible one. As he put it in a letter to Joseph de Maistre, quote, "Since reason has proclaimed itself sovereign, one must go straight at it, seize it on its throne, and force it on pain of death to prostrate it before the reason of God," unquote. That's Lamennais. That's his idea. For Lamennais, truth is only possible in society as part of a tradition. It means the tradition of the church, basically. And in particular, he invokes what he calls common sense. And by common sense, he means that, quote, I'm quoting here, that which all men invincibly believe. He's invoking the common sentiments of mankind. And this common sentiment or feeling is the basis of this certitude about religious faith. And this is wildly popular. It's written in a very highly emotional style, very much suited to the times. It's the age of Romanticism. He's a very romantic writer in a lot of ways. And it made Lamennais a public figure. He was the first, and I forgot to mention this, he was ordained in 1816, largely against his inclinations. His mentors wanted him to do this. He became a clergyman. I forgot. He's called the Abbé de Lamennais for a reason. My apologies. But he became the first, priest, the first cleric in France to be a public figure in, since probably the 1740s. Nobody paid attention to what the clergy said. After 1750 or so in France, there was already a lot of skepticism and cynicism about what the church had to say. Even a clerical critic of his admitted, quote, that this book could bring the dead back to life. It was, unquote. It was this kind of like, it was this, energetic book. Which really, again, this is what made him a star in ecclesiastical circles. He got the attention of the secular world, of secular society, because they were buying and reading this book too. So, huge figure because of that. Subsequent volumes, several volumes of that book were published, but they weren't. The later volumes weren't as well received. However, from this point onward, Lamennais becomes the sort of oracle of the younger clergy, especially. And even younger Catholics of that generation, but definitely the clergy, hung on his every word. He became a real star in the church, and this is significant for a couple of reasons. One is that Lamennais, in his apologetics, he's attacking the rationalism of the sort of anti-clerical middle classes is what he's doing. And this becomes a preoccupation of French apologetics in the Catholic Church in France the rest of the century. But he also attacked not just, Enlightenment philosophy. He attacked every form of rationalism. Not just that, stuff coming out of the Revolution, but also he attacked the scholasticism of the seminaries. And part of the reason for this is, again, they thought it was old. He didn't think it was, it was never going to reach a secular society, basically. But his criticisms were actually correct at the time, because scholasticism was not, at that point, it was in a bad way, actually. The teaching in the seminary is very inadequate. I mentioned this earlier episodes on this topic. But a lot of what passed for scholasticism was not, it wasn't Thomas, it wasn't Thomism. It was Cartesianism in a scholastic form. Maybe some Aristotle, maybe some Thomism. There was always some Thomists there. But even then, a lot of the Thomism practiced in those seminaries was based on later commentators and not on the original works of Thomas himself. And Lamennais wanted to replace old methods, both of apologetics and theology. and particularly replaced scholasticism with what he called a Christian philosophy. Not these, there's a sense that reason has been sort of tainted by atheism or something amongst these apologists, and Lamennais first among them. We need to replace it with something. So it's very crucial to understand that, I think, for the rest of the episodes. But his influence was far-reaching, to say the very least. He attracted around himself a younger generation of Catholics, clergymen such as Henri Lacordaire. Henri Lacordaire was one of the great preachers in 19th century France. Later on in his career, he would give a series of sermons at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, which were attended by, again, people who weren't Catholic. He's also, Lacordaire was also the person who later on brought the Dominicans back to France. They had been driven out by the revolution, never came back, and he's the one who reestablished them there. As well, someone like Dom Prosper Guéranger. If you know who Dom Prosper Guéranger is, if you're a traditionalist, you should know that name. Or if you're into Gregorian chant. Dom Prosper Guéranger was a Benedictine abbot who founded or was the abbot of Solesmes in France, which is the monastery where the monks there revived Gregorian chant in the 19th century. And in fact, Guéranger later on basically distanced himself, never talks about his relationship with Lamennais for reasons that become apparent. But he was kind of in this romantic liberalism along with these other people. And laymen like Charles Montalembert, who was a lawyer and historian, politician, who also will have reason to talk about him later on in this series. In other words, some of the best minds in the French church during the coming decades aligned themselves with Lamennais. And so Lamennais became the acknowledged leader of a whole generation of Catholics. So much so that one historian wrote of Lamennais' quote, spiritual dictatorship over the French church. So hugely important for the history of the French church. And as I'll try to argue later on, I think he's one of the most important figures in the entire modern church. By modern church, I mean since the French Revolution. He's really important to know. If you're an Anglophone listener of this podcast, I'm not sure you know who he is, but he's important, to say the least. And besides his apologetics, Lamennais wasn't just into writing and talking. Lamennais wanted to use this apologetic to basically reconquer France for the church, to put his new quote-unquote Christian philosophy into practice. He coined the term Catholic action to describe his proposed reform, but also re-Catholicizing of society. And what do you mean by that? He meant encouraging his followers, both laymen and clergy. He did encourage the laymen to involve themselves, to address the social problems of modern society through applying the church's faith and teaching to them. And again, this should sound, by the way, the term Catholic action, that'll have a long shelf life. We'll get to this maybe at the end of this podcast and later on. Catholic action will become a term for lay groups, lay organizations in the Catholic Church, which try to influence secular society in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So cannot stress enough just how important he was, and especially, again, not just in France, because he'll have influence elsewhere. His influence will spread to other countries. Someone who got the attention of secular society and seemed to get them to listen. All the while, by the way, being a total ultramontane. If you remember that phrase from my earlier podcast on this topic, he exalts the authority of the papacy. So how does he become a liberal and become the leader of the liberalism? Well, first of all, this is where you talk about here, I'm emphasizing Lamennais. He's not he doesn't invent this or cause all of this. And in fact, the occasion for the emergence of something called Catholic Liberalism is, is what happens in Belgium, of all places, in the 1820s. Now, I need to explain this. If you don't know what Belgium is, it's a country today south of the Netherlands. It had been part of the Spanish Empire at one point, the Austrian Empire. After the Congress of Vienna, after the Napoleonic Wars, the Congress of Vienna created a kingdom called the Kingdom of the Netherlands, which united the Calvinist Northern Protestants of the Netherlands with the Catholic provinces of the South, what we know today as Belgium. And this was effectively a sort of constitutional monarchy. It had freedom of the press, had freedom of religion, more or less. And a lot of Belgian Catholics regarded this made-up kingdom as a Protestant imposition on their faith. And this is very different than in the North, where Dutch Catholics had been a sort of minority, barely tolerated in the North. They thought this was a big improvement, but not so much in Belgium. Now, what happens is starting in the late 18 teens, going in the 1820s, is that the state in the Netherlands, the kingdom, begins to take steps to laicize education. In other words, to get them out of the hands of the clergy, culminating in some ordinances of 1825, which dissolved all non-state secondary schools, free secondary schools, and established a college of philosophy, whose attendance was mandatory for all men seeking the priesthood. Obviously, this touched directly on education of the Catholic clergy. And funny enough, I mentioned some Belgian Catholics being peeved at the creation of the state. These education laws were actually welcomed by a lot of middle-class Belgian Catholics. Why? Because it meant the diminution of clerical authority. They didn't want clergy dominating their lives like they had before the Revolution. On the other hand, most of the Belgian priests were violently opposed to these regulations, along with a few influential Dutchmen. And they raised a hue and cry. They forced the government to renegotiate a concordat with Rome in 1827. However, opposition from Dutch Calvinists in the north, but also Belgian liberals, secular liberals, in the south, delayed implementing the concordat and began laicizing schools again. It's at this point that Belgian Catholics abandoned any hope of negotiating and began demanding complete independence from the state. And in particular, you begin to have, I need to stress this, you have the creation of Catholic newspapers in Belgium. And Belgians were some of the first to embrace the press. They lead this campaign. Why is that important? Because a lot of the Catholic world, and definitely Rome, regarded the press as the invention of the devil, because the press had been used by the French revolutionaries to cast odium on the French monarchy and overthrow it. So this is a kind of a risque thing to do, to throw in your lot with this, and they did. These Catholic newspapers formed an alliance with Belgian liberals. People have been anti-clerical. And they demanded, as one of them put it, quote, freedom in everything and for everything, unquote. The deal they sort of struck with these secular liberals was that the liberals would support educational freedom from the church, while the church would help push for, quote unquote, modern freedoms. Freedom of, press, freedom of, conscience, stuff like this. Now, it should be pointed out here, this was not necessarily a principled thing. This was mostly meant by most of these Catholics who embraced this, definitely the clergy who did, as a provisional agreement, merely for the purposes of securing freedom of education for the church. But this alliance was widely accepted. And this is going to change the minds of some people in and outside of Belgium about liberalism, because it had been seen as like, a force of the devil before this. And one of these people who's going to be influenced by this is, of course, Lamennais. 1825, he writes a book called De la Religion, on religion, in which he basically advised the church in France to break with the Bourbon regime. Remember, when the Bourbons were restored in 1815, clergy, bishops sort of threw in their lot with them, very closely tied to this regime, which a lot of, again, the sort of anti-clerical middle class deeply resented. But for Lamennais, its problem is that this tie with the Bourbon regime made for too many compromises with liberalism itself. At this point, his ultramontanism is completely undefected. He exalts the Pope to the heavens. He thought any limitation of the Pope's authority was unacceptable. As he put it, no Pope, no church. But what's happening, he's beginning to sort of think in terms of, well, The Pope's authority can be exercised much better if we're not tied to this regime that seems to be either hostile or corrupt. Hostile to the church or corrupt. And he writes a book in 1829 on the progress of the revolution and the war against the church. And he begins to argue that liberalism can be reconciled with the church. His ideal is still very much ultramontane, even theocratic at this point. But he is increasingly seeing the church as the representative of the people against the dictates of a corrupt state. And again, people, the younger clergy, eat this up because they're tired of the compromises that the church is making with an increasingly hostile state. But the bishops are adamantly opposed to this. Again, a lot of these bishops, I mentioned the term Gallicanism, the bishops are still Gallican at this point. Many of them became bishops because of the Concordat that was signed with Napoleon back in the early 1800s. They still think in these older terms. The state has a right to sort of dictate things to the church. And what's happening, and this is where Lamennais is in some ways the inventor of Catholic liberalism. He's groping toward making the Belgian solution, as we'll put it that way, the Belgian solution as not merely a temporary expedient, but as a positive ideal to be sought. He was taking, in effect, a solution that was created for a situation in which the church was a minority, in Belgium, other places too, where, you agree to religious equality in law, freedom of the press, education, and turning it into a solution for where it was still the majority. Because it makes sense, by the way, when you're a minority to argue for equality. Why? Because someone has a lot more power than you. You want to say, yeah, we want to be equal. When you have power, you say no. But, of course, the church it's lost its esteem in the eyes of a big chunk of the French people. So he takes this idea and turns it to French and the rest of society, French society, and actually every other European society. In effect, he wants to baptize liberalism. In a letter he writes to someone, quote, "We tremble before liberalism. Oh well, Catholicize it, and society will be reborn." Unquote. In Lamennais' mind, an alliance with liberalism was necessary because society had irrevocably changed, and the church had to adapt to modern society in order to bring it back to the faith. And it is Lamennais who's largely responsible for turning the Belgian example into a principle and into a movement that gets to be called Catholic liberalism. And he had several newspapers that he had started, and he's doing this as well. Press, one called Catholic Memorial, another called Catholic Review, and they espouse these positions. But it was a liberal Parisian newspaper named The Globe, which first gave the epithet liberal Catholics to the followers of Lamennais in 1829, initially referring not to Lamennais, but to readers and writers of another French Catholic paper, The Correspondent, which was, again, following Lamennais' line. So by 1829, you've almost got something like Catholic liberalism about to emerge. What catalyzes this and makes it something into a movement, well, is another revolution. By the 1820s, there was a serious anti-clerical reaction setting in amongst the middle classes in France. They didn't like the restored monarchy's close ties to the church. After Louis XVIII died, his brother Charles X became king. Louis XVIII was a lot more subtle as a politician. Charles X was not. He brought back the influence of the ultras, the people who really hated any sort of deviation from the old regime. And they attempted to smother, he and his advisors, liberal opposition in the parliament. They passed laws against sacrilege. They manipulated voter rolls to suppress support for liberal candidates in elections. This led to a backlash in which liberals eventually organized themselves politically and managed to regain a foothold in parliament. Eventually, by the end of the 1820s, they began taking over larger and larger chunks. And by 1827, the power of the ultras in this parliament had been reduced greatly. 1829, Charles X opened his parliament with a speech attacking the liberals, to which they responded by giving him a vote of no confidence. When he called for new elections that same year, the Liberals promptly won a large majority. At this point, Charles X, goaded by his most extreme advisors, published 4 ordinances on July 26, 1830. He ordered liberal newspapers, whom he blamed for the political conflict, to close. But other ordinances dissolved the Parliament, called for a fresh election in which the wealthiest 25% of a very restricted electorate determined the outcome. Now, at this point, an economic depression had hit France, and so what happens is you had artisans in Paris been staging protests for several years at this point over unemployment and other economic hardships. What happens is immediately following the publication of these ordinances, the liberal press makes common cause with these artisans. Journalists and printers protest. Businessmen shut down shops and factories. On Tuesday, 27th of July, police attempted to close the newspapers. They were resisted. Tricolor flag goes up, royal insignia are torn down, and fighting starts. The next day, on the 28th, barricades went up throughout the city, and the government declared martial law. However, its troops were undermanned and sympathetic to the rioters. They suffered heavy losses, with some defecting to the other side. Eventually, the army broke up as it retreated in disorder. This left Paris in the hands of a makeshift committee of deputies and other rabble-rousers, and they refused to negotiate with Charles, and activists began pushing Louis-Philippe, the Duc d'Orléans, another nobleman with ties to the monarchy, as an alternative. Louis-Philippe makes his way into Paris on Saturday, July 31st, wins popular approval to act as a lieutenant general of, I guess, the revolution. Shortly thereafter, Charles X abdicates, and Louis-Philippe is invited to take the throne. The Charter of 1814 is revised, and August 9th, he takes his oath as the, quote, King of the French, and secures his regime in Paris. This is sometimes called the July Revolution, and this is effectively the uprising of the middle classes against what they see as a despotic clericalist regime. And what happens is this sets off revolts across Europe, some successful, some not. One is in Belgium. Belgians break away from the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and they're allowed to establish their own independent kingdom. In Poland, the same year, the Poles rise up against the Russians. They are brutally suppressed. There are also uprisings in Italy, which are also suppressed. You also have what you might call parliamentary revolutions in Switzerland. In the cantons, people there demand more representation. They get it. In Britain, in 1832, they passed the so-called Great Reform Act, which altered the franchise for the first time in Britain's history, largely in response to this, to the French. They were terrified that the revolutionary virus would spread from France to the rest of Europe. One member of Parliament in Britain, during the debates on the Great Reform Act of 1832, said that when Paris sneezes, Europe catches cold. In other words, if we don't do something to act and cut this off, it'll fester into a revolution. And so the spirit of 1830, again, brings back this, this spirit of anti-clericalism and this spirit of revolution. And it's very much a liberal revolution in secular terms, a revolution of the middle classes in France and elsewhere. Now, this had, of course, an effect on Lamennais, who's already been pushing toward these ideas. Well, the Revolution of 1830 proved to Lamennais that he'd been right all along, that the church needed definitely to sort of go whole hog in with embracing modern society and modern notions of liberty. On October 30th, 1830, he began publishing a newspaper called L'Avenir, which, if you know what that means in French, it means the future, whose motto was God and Liberty. In it, he and his other writers advocated a sort of full embrace of the Revolution of 1789, full panoply of liberal freedoms, freedom of religion, yada, 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 freedom of the press. They supported a universal franchise, And he threw his weight behind the democratic revolutions in Europe, especially the Poles. I'll come back to this in a second. But the Belgian Constitution of 1831 as well, which guaranteed freedom of education and association with the church. Which, again, if you're thinking about this, you have to understand, in France, the religious orders were not free. The religious orders could not come into France and just set up shop for a variety of reasons, and we'll go into it. So this seems like a good idea to Lamennais in many ways. Lamennais went in whole hog for an alliance between liberals and the church, saying that everyone should respect, quote, everybody's right to do anything that is not against right. As you can imagine, the bishops in France were not too pleased with this, especially because Lamennais, these are really delicate subjects, obviously. He discussed them in a fairly abrasive manner. He denounced bishops. Many people resented the way he attacked scholastic theologians, who he thought were, passé, this dead philosophy or whatever, in very, very harsh terms, and it made him a lot of enemies, particularly the bishops. The bishops began seriously criticizing L'Avenir, and its membership began to decline, subscribership, I guess I should say, which had never reached more than 3,000 members. It was still wildly influential, don't get me wrong, but it had an effect. It dampened the public enthusiasm for him a little bit. And these bishops, by the way, again, there's a lot to say against them, to be honest with you, but they were worried about other things besides their own, being their own egos. They were worried about the divisions that Lamennais was creating amongst the clergy. One writer described Lamennais, quote, as the idol of the young priests, but a vexation to all old clergymen and pious believers, unquote. The fact that he got the younger generation on board had been something people pretty much universally thought was a good thing. But now he's beginning to turn the younger generation seemingly against the church, well, at least the bishops themselves. Many of them were older. They don't share the same, view of things. And being attacked like this, he expected a defense of what he was doing to come from Rome. He thought Rome would be on his side. And he was an ultramontane. Again, you're wondering why he's an ultramontane. He's still at this point saying, we need authority. And what we need, basically, is that authority to be freed from interference from the state. But that defense never comes, as we'll see. And in fact, in response to that, he shuts down L'Avenir in October of 1831. So it only runs for a year, but it's hugely controversial. And the reason why is that Rome's response to all this was alarm. Now, one of the things about the Vatican in this period, they favored the so-called Holy Alliance, which was created in 1815. This is an alliance of restored monarchies, Austria, Russia, and Bourbon France. The Holy Alliance was an alliance of basically absolute monarchies, or would-be absolute monarchies, who wanted to suppress nationalist movements and revolutionary movements in general, liberal ones, those sorts of things. And Rome favored this alliance as a bulwark against social disorder. It thought revolutionary ideas were a plague wherever they spread. This is very crucial to understand. Lamennais, realizing this, went to Rome in 1832 to try to head off any potential condemnation of his work. He took Lacordaire and Montalembert with him, and he stayed there for nearly 10 months. After a few weeks, the only communication he got after a month or two, because the Pope refused to meet him, he got communication from a curial official who basically advised him to let the matter drop quietly. When this happened, Lacordaire took off. Eventually, Montalembert did too. Eventually he left and went back. He was visiting friends in Munich. He had admirers in Munich, but at this point, Gregory XVI decided he needed to do something. And he was pushed, by the way, by representatives of Austria and Russia to do this. And he issued an encyclical, Mirare Vos, in August of 1832, which never mentions Lamennais or his writings, but plainly condemns many of the things that appeared in L'Avenir. Rome made it clear that it did not condemn the Belgian constitution as long as the church's rights were respected, but it condemned the idea that all religions are equal, or that the freedom to dispense with any doctrine one wished amounted to progress. And so it was seen as being a blow against Catholic liberalism, attempts to sort of make this alliance, attempts to push this as an ideal. It was in many ways very crushing to Lamennais, however. He thought for sure Rome would back him. Here he is trying to re-Catholicize society, and to him this is just a means to an end to the liberalism. It's more than a means to an end, actually, but still, he thinks this is necessary to do that. And it took him several months, but he eventually did publish a declaration stating his submission to Rome. However, many in France were not satisfied. They wanted a fuller expression of submission. Again, people who hated his guts. At the same time, a newspaper published a letter of Lamennais in which he said he would restart L'Avenir, which caused a furor in Rome. Now, it was published, by the way, he wrote it before Meteoric had been published. So it was really, somebody did a dirty trick on him, I think. But this poisoned his relationship with Rome completely. They now suspected him of duplicity and just out now lying to them. There was a series of letters exchanged between him and Rome, but Rome was not mollified at all. He kept, trying to get the Pope to grant him freedom of thought in the political sphere. At this point, he was not much concerned with religion anymore. He was concerned particularly about the liberation of oppressed peoples, the Poles. I'll get to the Poles in a second. And Gregory XVI, who was the Pope at the time, refused to grant this. Eventually, he was worn down by all this and signed another submission, submitting clearly to all the teachings of Meteoric. In fact, he would sign 4 separate submissions, statements of submission. In a letter to D'Alembert, he did this. He told him basically he did this because he couldn't take it anymore. He said he would have signed any statement to end the affair, even if they'd asked him to sign the statement that the Pope was God. He also said to D'Alembert that he felt, quote, very strong reservations about several points of Catholicism, unquote, and that, unquote, quote, the Church could not remain as it is because no attempt has ever been made to distinguish between the human, divine, and the human, unquote. And again, basically what happens is the condemnation of liberal ideas and Meteoric destroys his faith in Rome. He put so much emphasis on authority. When the authority smacked down on him, it killed his faith in some regards. And again, part of the reason why this was so devastating is not just that. I mean, there's that his sort of fideism, I think, feeds into that. It's also because he could not understand why the Pope was backing Russia against the Polish uprising. Remember, the Poles are Catholic. They're being dominated by Orthodox, who, trust me, the Orthodox and the Catholics today play nice all the time. Or the Catholic Church talked about them as being schismatics and heretics. So the Pope is backing a schismatic, heretic monarchy over the Poles. Why? For reasons of social order. And so this really, it just destroyed, I think, in some ways, his faith, which I think was too much based on the authority of the Pope. Eventually, he gave up writing on religious matters entirely, and in 1834, he renounced his priestly duties. At the same time, he published a work called Paroles d'un Croyant, which is the words of a believer, which was an apocalyptic denunciation of European leaders, society, for aligning with corrupt regimes. It's kind of by proxy a denunciation of the Pope. And it is also a prediction of a future in which Christ would liberate the oppressed peoples of the earth. It's a really barn-burning type of work. One historian described it as, quote, a lyrical version of the Communist Manifesto. Because by this time, he is much more concerned about the working classes and liberating them from domination than anything else. This couldn't go unanswered. Within a few months, in 1834, Rome issued Signi Laudae Nos, which condemned Lamennais and his teachings by name, along with the doctrine of traditionalism in a brief statement. By 1836, Lamennais has abandoned the church altogether. He will spend the rest of his career writing about politics mostly, not gaining much of a... Once he's no longer Catholic, I don't think there was much interest in his work outside of the church. And he was always concerned with the regeneration of society. That was his big thing. Even back when he was still Catholic, his statement that, if you Catholicize liberalism, society will be reborn. His big idea earlier was to Catholicize the modern world. And he never left off thinking about how society can be regenerated because he thought it was in a bad way. He did get involved in politics again later on, but he ended his life pretty disillusioned. He died in 1854, unreconciled with the church. Even though he was never formally excommunicated, he basically left and stopped practicing. And that is the sad tale of the Abbé de Lamennais. Just a few words to wrap up all this. Well, first thing right now is that this is the end of Lamennais, unfortunately. This was no way, shape, or form the end of Catholic liberalism. Oh no, it's just getting started, really, in the 19th century. Partly because Lamennais leaves behind him a legacy. There are many, many young clergy who are deeply influenced by his ideas, theologians who will carry on his banner of his ideas, trying to Catholicize modern society. The shadow of Lamennais is a long and broad one. And again, as you'll see in later episodes on this topic, he in some ways his ideas are vindicated by the Vatican in the latter part of the 19th century to a degree. And he leaves behind him this desire to try to engage with the modern world, to baptize it, if you will. He leaves behind him a legacy of apologetics, attacking modern ideals of rationalism that are irreligious. But he also leaves behind an apologetic of fideism, which puts a lot of stress on authority, a lot of stress on the will, on voluntarism. We talked about that earlier last episode. And his ultramontanism. He's one of the people who actually makes that the dominant mode in France and other places going forward. That'll be a huge thing. So he's hugely important for all those reasons. And I should mention, he's not the only one arguing for these ideas in theological terms. Fideism, voluntarism. Writers like Man de Burin, who was a philosopher, advocated a voluntarist philosophy in the early part of the 19th century. Louis Bautain, who was, again, a traditionalist in that sense. He stressed revelation as the only certain base of knowledge in his early writings. The point here is that all of them, and this is about Catholic liberalism, and it comes from a really powerfully felt need to combat rationalist skepticism about faith. And it led them in directions which, as you will see, you get to the later part of the century, tended to lead it away from orthodoxy. Tendency. Most of the people we're going to talk about in this series did not leave the church, didn't die outside of it. But it would lead them that direction, even when it wasn't always aligned, those theological ideas, weren't always aligned with liberal stances on church-state relations, which were easily separable from these ideas I've just been talking about, fideism, voluntarism, or the need to Catholicize, parts of modern society. Those things are separable. That's why Catholic liberalism is not de facto a heresy per se, although the part of it is, as we'll see. And so that is the pod on Lamennais and the origins of liberalism. Next time, we're going to talk about some of the other sources for liberalism outside the French-speaking world, mostly from Germany and Italy in the early 19th century, as well as the influence of Lamennais in other countries on people in places like Britain, English Catholics, and even discuss briefly the role of, we'll get into this later on as well, someone like John Henry Newman. I know, I know. The guy was as anti-liberal as he could be, but he does have a role to play in all this, despite all that. So that's it for this podcast. If you like it, please go, like and subscribe to our podcast. Go to YouTube channel and subscribe. Ring the bell. You get notified every time I have a new episode up there. Yeah, like our page on Facebook. Please tell people about this, about what we're doing here, so we can spread the word and get controversies in church history more widely known. But thank you guys so much for listening. I really appreciate it. God bless you all. Take care and have a great day.